The late afternoon sun painted Veridian Park in strokes of gold, its warm light dappling the weathered bench where Julian Croft sat, lost in the world of his book. The gentle symphony of rustling leaves and the distant, joyful shouts of children playing was a welcome melody. This park was his haven, a quiet island of peace in the city's roaring sea, a place to still his mind and shed the weight of his profession. Today, however, that peace was destined to be shattered. Across the sprawling lawn, Officer Evan Roche was on patrol, his gaze sweeping over the landscape with a practiced, sharp intensity. He'd walked this same beat for 20 years, and in Oilia, the fortress of his mind, he believed he knew its every secret, its every shadow. When his eyes landed on Julian, a solitary figure on a distant bench, a familiar and trusted instinct coiled in his gut. A black man, sitting all by himself, entirely too calm, far too composed. Suspicion, sharp and sudden, pricked at the edges of his consciousness. "Never seen him in this part of town before," Evan muttered, the words a ghost of a whisper on the air. He paused, his focus narrowing on Julian, trying to give a name to the unease churning within him. There had been bulletins, vague reports of a suspect whose general description could, with a stretch, fit the man on the bench. It was a flimsy, threadbare lead, but for Evan it was more than enough. Julian felt the undeniable weight of a stare and slowly looked up, his connection to the printed page dissolving. He saw him then, Officer Roche, standing a ways off, his gaze a piercing, all too familiar look. Julian had been the subject of that gaze more times than he could count. He could read the officer's expression as easily as the book in his hands. It was the cold mask of prejudice, masquerading as professional concern, a suspicion born of nothing more than the color of his skin. Yet Julian did not flinch. Instead, he closed his book with deliberate slowness, marking his page with a finger, and met the officer's stare with a calm, unwavering gaze of his own. Evan's hand tightened instinctively around his baton. The way the man looked back at him, so steady, so utterly devoid of fear, it set him on edge. It wasn't right. "Let's see what this one's story is," Evan murmured, his own words fueling his resolve as he began a direct, purposeful walk toward Julian, his posture growing more rigid with every step. He didn't like that look, that unnerving calm. It was a challenge, a silent, unsettling challenge. Julian watched the officer's approach, his own expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. He knew this script by heart. He had played this part in this same scene countless times before. The air was already charged, and he understood that his every word, his every micro-expression in the coming moments would dictate the course of this encounter. He had no appetite for this drama today, but neither would he offer the officer a single reason to escalate. "Afternoon," Evan said as he finally reached the bench. His tone was a thin veneer of politeness, stretched taut over a core of accusation. Julian could hear it, the suspicion humming just beneath the surface. "Afternoon," Julian replied, his voice a steady, even current. He kept his hands in plain sight, resting them on the closed book in his lap. "What brings you out to the park today?" Evan asked, his eyes doing a quick, dismissive scan of Julian's face before flicking down to the book. He was digging, searching, for any crack, any fissure in Julian's composure that might justify the feeling gnawing at him. "Just enjoying the quiet," Julian said simply. "It's a beautiful day." Evan gave a slow, deliberate nod, though he wasn't truly listening. He was far more interested in the unspoken words, in the truths he was certain he could excavate from beneath the calm surface. "You from this area?" Julian offered a slight smile, a subtle curve of his lips that never reached his eyes. "I've been around." The non-answer grated on Evan. He shifted his weight, his stance transforming from inquisitive to confrontational. Mind if I see some identification?" Julian's faint smile vanished. This was the precipice, the point where the ground could crumble beneath them. He knew his rights perfectly. He knew he was under no obligation to produce identification for the simple act of sitting in a public park, but he also knew that refusal was a spark that could ignite a powder keg. Still, a quiet resolve settled in him. He would not be intimidated. "Am I under arrest, officer?" Julian asked, his tone perfectly measured, his gaze locking with Evan's, unwavering. The question made Evan bristle. There it was again, that infuriating, calm, that silent refusal to be cowed. It made him feel unsteady, as if the control of the situation was slipping through his fingers. "You will be if you don't cooperate," he snapped back, his hand instinctively dropping to rest on the butt of his service weapon. Julian drew a slow, deliberate breath, keeping his features placid. He did not like the direction this was heading, but he would not, could not, back down. "I'm just sitting here in a park," he stated, his voice a pillar of steadiness. "Is there a law that prohibits that?" Evan's patience, already thin, was beginning to shred. "You fit the description of a person of interest," he declared, though the excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over Julian. Julian remained perfectly still. He held Evan's gaze, denying him the reaction, the fear he so clearly sought. "And what description would that be?" Julian asked, his voice a quiet challenge. Evan's jaw tightened. He had no real answer, and he knew it. But to admit that now would be to lose face, to surrender control. He would not let that happen. "Don't get smart with me," he snarled. "Show me your ID, now." For a long, charged moment, the two men were locked in a battle of wills, the tension between them a palpable, vibrating thing. Julian understood he could push back, that he could stand on his rights, but he also knew that in this charged atmosphere, doing so could make a dangerous situation deadly. He chose, for now, to comply. Wordlessly, he reached into his pocket, his movements slow and meticulously deliberate, and retrieved his wallet. Evan watched every motion, his body tensed like a coiled spring. As Julian handed over his identification, Evan snatched it from his grasp. A quick glance at the name meant nothing to him. His mind was already made up. "Stand up," Evan commanded, taking a step back to create space. Julian sighed, the sound inaudible, but he did as instructed, rising slowly from the bench. He kept his hands visible, offering no pretense, no excuse for Evan to claim he felt threatened. "Turn around," Evan said, the metallic click of handcuffs being drawn echoing in the quiet park. A surge of pure frustration coursed through Julian, but he forced it down, burying it deep. He turned, allowing Evan to cuff his hands behind his back without a hint of resistance. He could hear the murmurs of onlookers, feel their stares burning into his back, but he remained a statue of calm. He knew with absolute certainty that the worst thing he could do right now was to surrender to anger. As Evan ratcheted the cold steel tight around Julian's wrists, he couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong, that he was crossing a line from which there was no return. But his pride, his stubborn pride, would not let him stop. He gripped Julian's arm and began marching him toward the patrol car parked at the curb. Julian said nothing as they walked, his mind already shifting gears, calculating the steps that would come next. He wasn't worried for himself. He knew who he was. He knew that this officer would discover the truth soon enough, but he couldn't help but feel a profound weariness, a soul-deep exhaustion that went far beyond this single, ugly encounter. It was the exhaustion of knowing that despite all he had achieved, despite all his efforts, in the eyes of far too many people, like Officer Evan Roche, he would always be seen as just another black man. They reached the patrol car. Evan pulled, opened the back door, and guided Julian inside, the unresolved tension hanging thick and heavy in the air. Julian settled onto the hard seat, the cold metal of the cuffs a biting reminder of his powerlessness. He stared out the window as the car pulled away from the curb, watching the serene greenery of the park blur into a meaningless smear of color, wondering how this day, like so many others before it, had gone so terribly, so predictably Wrong, the bomb. Low hum of the patrol car's engine filled the space between Officer Evan Roche and his silent passenger. Evan's hands were clamped around the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as he replayed the arrest in his head. He was bothered by the way Julian Croft had looked at him back in the park, calm, unafraid, as if he held a secret Evan couldn't possibly comprehend. It gnawed at him, that look. It made him question his own instincts, but his pride was a fortress, and he refused to admit even to himself that he might have made a mistake. In the back seat, Julian sat quietly, his hands cuffed behind him. The city streets drifted by in a blur, but his focus was internal. He was thinking about the next move, the move after that. He knew the system. He knew how a spark of misunderstanding could become an inferno if not handled with precise care. But he also knew his own power, the quiet authority that came with his position, an authority Officer Roche was completely, dangerously unaware of. As they approached the precinct, Evan glanced at Julian in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice laced with the same suspicion that had started it all. Julian met his eyes in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he replied, his voice a calm, level plane. "I was reading." Evan scoffed. "A guy like you? Just sitting around reading a book? You really expect me to buy that?" Julian's eyebrow arched almost imperceptibly. "A guy like me," he repeated, his tone measured, letting the words hang in the air between them. Evan faltered for a second, a flicker of awareness crossing his face. He recognized the implication in his own words, but instead of retreating, he dug in deeper. "You don't look like the type to spend his afternoons reading books in the park, Mum," he said, the words in clumsy attempt to justify his actions. Julian didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, letting the tension in the car build, molecule by molecule. When he finally spoke, his voice was cool, controlled, and sharp as glass. "And what exactly does someone like me look like, officer?" Evan had no answer. He couldn't answer. He knew precisely what he was implying, and he knew exactly how it sounded, but he wasn't about to admit it. Not to Julian, not to himself. He focused on the road, his frustration mounting with every passing moment, unsettled by the man in his back seat whose composure was a fortress he could not breach. The car pulled into the precinct's lot, and Evan parked near the entrance. He got out, then opened the back door to escort Julian from the car, the cuffs still biting into Julian's wrists. As they walked toward the building, Evan's thoughts were a chaotic storm. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to be scared, supposed to be compliant. Not this, not composed and challenging him with every measured word and silent gaze. Inside the precinct, the familiar chorus of activity filled the air. Officers filing reports, phones ringing, the steady hum of conversations. Evan led Julian through the main hall, pointedly ignoring the curious glances they received from his colleagues. He didn't want to explain himself yet, not until he knew what his next move was. They reached the booking area. Evan gestured for Julian to stand by the processing desk. The officer on duty, a younger man named Calloway, looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "What's going on here, Roche?" Calloway asked, his gaze flicking from Julian to Evan and back again. "Caught him acting suspicious down at Veridian Park," Evan replied, his tone clipped. He handed over Julian's ID, still unwilling to admit to anyone, least of all himself, that he had no solid reason for the arrest. Calloway took the ID, glanced at it, and then looked at Julian. For a split second, a flicker of recognition, of something more than just professional interest, crossed his face before he quickly masked it. He nodded and began typing the name into the computer system. Julian saw it. He saw that brief hesitation, that fleeting moment of recognition, and filed it away. Someone here knew him. "Captain Rostova is in her office," Calloway said, handing the ID back to Evan. "You'll need to take him to her." Evan's posture stiffened. Captain Eva Rostova was known for being tough but fair, a woman who lived by the book. He hadn't intended to involve her this early, but he had no choice now. "All right," Evan said, his voice tight. He turned back to Julian, his grip firm on his arm. "Let's go." Julian walked beside him, his expression still unreadable. As they neared Captain Rostova's office, he could sense the tension radiating from Evan, the uncertainty the officer was trying so desperately to conceal. It was the first crack in the armor, and Julian noted it with a quiet, grim satisfaction. Evan knocked on the door, then pushed it open at the sound of Rostova's voice from within. The office was immaculate, organized, dominated by large desks and shelves lined with books and legal files. Captain Rostova, a woman in her early 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense air, looked up from her paperwork. "Officer Roche," she said, her tone neutral. "What's this?" Evan stepped forward, guiding Julian into the room. "Found this one in the park, Captain. He was acting suspicious. Wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Rostova's gaze shifted to Julian, and for a fraction of a second, the same flicker of recognition that Julian had seen in Officer Calloway's eyes appeared in hers. She concealed it just as quickly, her expression becoming all business. "Is that so?" she said, her voice even. Julian met her gaze. He saw the recognition there beneath the surface. He knew that Captain Rostova knew exactly who he was, but she was playing this carefully, waiting to see how her officer would handle himself. "That's right," Evan forged ahead, oblivious to the silent communication passing between the captain and his prisoner. "I brought him in for questioning." Captain Rostova nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. "I see. And you had probable cause for this arrest, officer?" Evan hesitated, feeling the solid ground beneath him begin to tilt and shift. "He wouldn't cooperate, Captain," he repeated, but the words sounded weaker now, even to him. Captain Rostova leaned back in her chair, her eyes studying Evan with a new intensity. "Officer Roche, why don't you step outside for a moment? I would like to have a word with Mr. Croft. Alone." Evan blinked, blindsided by the request. "But, Captain—" "Outside, Roche," Rostova said, her tone firm, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Evan released Julian's arm and stepped out, closing the door behind him. The moment it clicked shut, Captain Rostova's demeanor changed, the hard professional edge softening slightly. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice calm, "my sincerest apologies for this misunderstanding." Julian allowed himself a small, wry smile. "There's no need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Rostova sighed, glancing toward the closed door. "I'm aware of who you are, but I would appreciate it if we could keep that between us for now. I need to handle this situation with a certain amount of care." Julian nodded. "Of course. I'm not here to create a problem, Captain. I just want to ensure things are handled correctly." "They will be," Rostova assured him. "I will. Speak with Officer Roche and deal with this. But I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you were from the start?" Julian's smile faded, replaced by a profound seriousness. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain," he said. "My title should not be the prerequisite for him to treat me with basic human respect." Captain Rostova considered his words, then gave a slow, understanding nod. "You're right. It shouldn't matter, but unfortunately, to some people, it still does." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing in. Finally, Captain Rostova stood. "I'll call Officer Roche back in. We will resolve this now." Julian nodded again, watching as she moved toward the door. The confrontation wasn't over, but the power had shifted. The truth was about to come out, and Officer Roche would have to face the consequences of his own prejudice. As Captain Rostova opened the door, Evan stepped back inside, his expression wary. He could feel the change in the atmosphere, but he didn't understand it. He glanced from Julian, who stood waiting calmly, to his captain. "Mr. Croft here is not the man you were looking for," Rostova stated, her voice clear and authoritative. "You will release him immediately." Evan blinked, the words taking a moment to register. "What?" "But, Captain, he—" "Immediately, officer." Rostova repeated, her tone leaving no room for debate. Evan hesitated, then finally, numbly reached for the keys to the handcuffs. His hand trembled slightly as he unlocked the cuffs, the full, crushing realization of his mistake finally beginning to dawn on him. As the cuffs clicked open, Julian rubbed his wrists, his gaze fixed on Evan, with a measured, unreadable expression. "Thank you, officer," he said, his tone calm, but carrying an unmistakable note of finality. Evan swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. You're free to go," he stammered, taking a step back. Julian nodded once, then turned to Captain Rostova. "I'll be in touch, Captain," he said quietly. "There is still a great deal to discuss." Captain Rostova met his gaze, understanding the full weight behind his words. "I look forward to it, Mr. Croft." With that, Julian Croft walked out of the office, leaving Officer Evan Roche standing alone, a cold, sinking feeling spreading through his gut. The confrontation was over. The consequences were just beginning. Evan Roche sat at his desk, but the precinct around him felt distant, muffled. A knot of tension in his gut refused to unwind. He hadn't been able to focus since Captain Rostova had dismissed Julian Croft, the deep sense of unease worsening with every passing minute because he still didn't fully grasp what had just transpired. He knew he had blundered catastrophically. But the true magnitude of his error remained just out of his reach, a terrifying shadow looming at the edge of his perception. The steady hum of the precinct was a low thrum beneath his spiraling thoughts. Then, the sound of footsteps approaching his desk pulled him sharply back to the present. He looked up. Captain Rostova was walking toward him, her expression grim and unreadable. Evan's stomach plummeted. He knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that this was not going to be a casual chat. "Roche, my office, now," Captain Rostova commanded, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. Evan rose from his chair, a wave of cold nervousness washing over him. He followed her down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the floor itself were trying to hold him back. Once inside her office, Captain Rostova closed the door, the soft click echoing in the tense silence. She gestured toward the chair opposite her desk. Evan sat, the unspoken weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him. Captain Rostova moved behind her desk and sat, her sharp eyes fixing on him. "Officer Roche," she began, her voice measured and stern. "Do you have any idea at all who Julian Croft is?" Evan shook his head, his confusion deepening into a new kind of fear. "No, Captain, just some guy from the park." Captain Rostova leaned forward, her gaze intense, unwavering. "Julian Croft isn't just some guy from the park, Roche. He's a special agent with the FBI. In fact, he's one of their top agents." The yucky words struck Evan with the force of a physical blow. His eyes widened in shock as the full, devastating implications of his actions crashed down upon him. An FBI agent?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "That's right," Rostova confirmed, her voice firm. "And more than that, he's one of the most respected agents in the entire Bureau. Your arresting him is going to have serious, far-reaching consequences, not just for you, but for this entire department." Evan's mind raced, a frantic, chaotic scramble to process the new reality. He had profiled, harassed, and wrongfully arrested an innocent man, a federal agent, based on nothing more than a gut feeling fueled by his own deep-seated bias. The sheer enormity of his mistake began to settle in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know, Captain," Evan stammered, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the entire problem, Roche," Rostova countered, her tone unyielding. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions were predicated on assumptions and prejudice, not on a single piece of actual evidence. You cannot arrest a man for sitting on a park bench just because he doesn't look like he belongs there in your eyes." Evan wanted to argue, to defend himself, to find some justification. but the words wouldn't form. Deep down, in a place he rarely acknowledged, he knew she was right. He had allowed his bias to steer his actions, and now he was caught in the wreckage. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice low, resigned. Captain Rostova sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now, you are on administrative leave, effective immediately, while we conduct a full internal investigation. I've already had a call from the higher-ups. To say they're unhappy would be a massive understatement. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could be facing disciplinary action up to and including termination." Evan's heart sank. Termination. The word hung in the air, a death sentence for the only life he'd ever known. He had been a cop for over 20 years. The thought of losing his badge, his career, his very identity, was almost too much to bear. But as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. I understand, Captain," Evan finally managed to say, his voice a choked whisper. Rostova studied him for a long moment, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "I know this is hard to hear, Roche, but you need to understand the gravity of this. Your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the community you are sworn to serve. We cannot afford to have officers on the street who let their personal biases dictate their decisions." Evan nodded, his mind still reeling. The reality of his situation was sinking in, and with it came a tidal wave of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, a protector of the community. Now, all of that was in jeopardy because of one reckless, prejudiced decision. Captain Rostova stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You're dismissed, Officer Roche. I will notify you when the review is scheduled." Evan pushed himself to his feet, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thank you, Captain," he mumbled, before turning and walking out of the office. As he left the precinct, the familiar sights and sounds that had once brought him a sense of purpose now felt alien and distant. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality of his predicament pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. He had been a cop for so long, he didn't know who he was without the badge. The thought of losing it, of being branded a failure, was terrifying, but beneath the fear, something else was stirring, a seed of doubt. For the first time in his long career, Evan was being forced to confront the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the stand-up officer he had always believed himself to be, that maybe his biases and prejudices had been guiding his actions, for far longer than he was willing to admit. As he drove home, the city streets blurring past his window, Evan couldn't shake the image of Julian Croft's calm, unflinching gaze. It was a look that had unsettled him from the very beginning, and now he finally understood why. Julian had seen right through him. He had known exactly what was happening, perhaps even before Evan himself did. When he finally arrived home, he sat in his car for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel. The day's events replayed in his mind over and over, each repetition making the weight of his actions heavier. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: his life had just been irrevocably changed. With a heavy sigh, Evan got out of the car and walked into his empty house. The silence pressed in on him. He sank into a chair, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret, and a profound, unsettling uncertainty. For the first time in a very long time, he had no idea what to do next. Evan Roche stood in the hallway outside the conference room, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The precinct felt unnaturally quiet, the air thick with the anticipation of the judgment that was about to unfold. The official review was set to begin, and Evan knew that every word spoken in the next hour could seal the fate of his entire career. He caught his reflection in the glass of a framed picture across the hall. The man staring back at him looked older, worn down. There was a new stiffness in his posture, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there just a few days ago. He straightened his uniform, took a deep, shuddering breath, and tried to focus. This was his chance to explain himself, to justify his actions, though a cold voice in the back of his mind whispered that there was no justification to be found. The conference room door opened, and Captain Rostova appeared, her expression impossible to read. "We're ready for you, Officer Roche," she said, her voice steady. Evan nodded, swallowing against the dryness in his throat as he followed her into the room. The atmosphere inside was glacial. A long table was lined with stern-faced officials, 2 representatives from Internal Affairs, a pair of high-ranking deputy chiefs, and at the far end of the table, a man in a crisp suit whom Evan instantly recognized. Julian Croft. His presence was like a punch to the gut. Evan had desperately hoped he wouldn't be here, that he wouldn't have to face him again. But there he was, sitting calmly, his focused gaze fixed on Evan, as if he were a specimen under a microscope. The look in his eyes was the same as it had been in the park, calm, unflinching, but now imbued with a quiet authority that made Evan feel small. Captain Rostova took her seat at the head of the table, motioning for Evan to sit in the chair directly opposite. He did so, trying to ignore the slick sweat on his palms. The room was utterly silent, the weight of judgment a palpable force. "Officer Roche," Rostova began, her tone strictly formal, "this review has been convened to determine the appropriateness of your actions during the arrest of Mr. Julian Croft. We will be going over the events leading up to the arrest, your conduct during that arrest, and the consequences that have followed. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" "Yes, Captain," Evan replied, his voice low but steady. He risked a brief glance at Julian, who watched him intently, before shifting his focus back to the captain. "Good," Rostova said with a nod. "Let's begin with your incident report. According to your statement, you arrested Mr. Croft because you believed he was a suspect in a recent series of robberies. Is that accurate?" Evan nodded. "Yes, Captain. I saw him in the park, and he matched the general description we had. Tall, black male, early 40s. He was acting suspiciously, so I initiated contact." "And what precisely was suspicious about his behavior?" Rostova asked, her tone neutral but probing. Evan hesitated, knowing how crucial his answer was. "He was alone, just sitting there, and when I asked him for his ID, he was evasive." "Evasive how?" Rostova pressed. "He didn't want to show me his ID right away," Evan explained, though the words sounded flimsy, even to his own ears. It seemed like he was hiding something. Julian's voice, calm but firm, cut through the tense air. "I was reading a book, Officer Roche. Not exactly the behavior of a criminal on the run." Evan flinched but kept his eyes locked on Rostova. "I was just doing my job, Captain, trying to protect the community." "And did you find anything on Mr. Croft that would indicate his involvement in any criminal activity whatsoever?" Rostova asked, her eyes narrowing. Evan shook his head. "No, Captain. He was clean." There was a long pause, a heavy silence that filled the room as the officials processed his words. Then one of the Internal Affairs officers spoke, his voice stern. "Officer Roche, did it ever occur to you that Mr. Croft might have been telling you the simple truth, that he wasn't the suspect you were looking for?" Evan hesitated again, his mind racing. I was following protocol. We're trained to be cautious, to assume someone could be dangerous until proven otherwise." "But did you consider," the officer asked pointedly, "that your assumptions might have been influenced by factors other than protocol?" Evan's throat tightened. He knew what they were implying, and he knew he had no good answer. "I didn't mean to profile him," he said, his voice faltering. "I was just doing my job." Julian leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Evan. "Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Roche, not to judge people based on the color of their skin." Evan met Julian's eyes, and for a fleeting moment, a surge of defensiveness rose within him, but it was quickly extinguished by a crushing wave of guilt. He had been in this profession long enough to know when he was in the wrong, and this was one of those times. Captain Rostova cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention. "Officer Roche, this review isn't just about what happened on that specific day. It's about the mindset that led to your actions. We must ensure that every officer in this precinct upholds the values of fairness and justice. This isn't just about you. It's about the integrity of the entire police force." Evan felt a familiar sinking feeling in his gut. He knew this wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about whether he was fit to continue wearing the badge. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, and for a moment he struggled to find his voice. "I understand, Captain," he finally said, his words barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to—" He trailed off, the words choking him. Rostova's expression softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "We all make mistakes, Roche, but it's how we learn from those mistakes that defines us. You need to think very carefully about the kind of officer you want to be." There was another long silence. Then Julian spoke again, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "Captain Rostova, may I say something?" Rostova nodded. "Of course, Mr. Croft." Julian stood, his presence commanding the room's attention. He looked directly at Evan, his expression serious, but not unkind. "I understand that being a police officer is a difficult, demanding job. You are under constant pressure, and sometimes that pressure can lead to poor decisions. But we cannot allow those poor decisions to go unexamined. This isn't just about holding Officer Roche accountable. It's about ensuring that something like this does not happen again." Evan listened, his heart heavy. He knew Julian was right, but the truth was a bitter pill to swallow. He had spent his entire career believing he was doing the right thing, only to be faced with the undeniable reality that his actions had caused real harm, that his own biases had blinded him. Julian continued, his voice steady. "I am not here to ruin any man's career, but I am here to make sure that the next time an officer encounters someone who looks like me, they think twice before making an assumption. This is an opportunity for change, and I hope that this department will take it seriously." Captain Rostova nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Croft. Your words are noted." Julian sat back down, his gaze still on Evan. There was no malice in his eyes, only a firm resolve that made it clear he would not tolerate injustice. Captain Rostova looked at Evan, her tone softer but still authoritative. "Officer Roche, you will remain on administrative leave while we continue this review. I suggest you use this time to reflect on what has been said here today. We will reconvene in a few days to discuss the next steps." Evan nodded numbly, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "Yes, Captain," he said quietly. The meeting was adjourned. As the officials began to file out, Evan remained seated, his mind racing. He had come here hoping to defend himself, but all he could think about was how profoundly wrong he had been. As the last of the officials left, Evan stood up slowly, his movements heavy. He glanced at Julian one last time, and their eyes met. There was no animosity in Julian's gaze, just a quiet determination. Evan looked away, unable to hold his gaze any longer. He knew he had a lot to think about. As he walked out of the conference room, the weight of his actions and their inevitable consequences hung over him like a dark, suffocating cloud. Captain Eva Rostova sat in her office, staring at the stack of reports on her desk. Each page represented a fragment of the truth she was piecing together. The internal investigation into Evan Roche's conduct was in full swing, and it was her responsibility to ensure that no detail was overlooked. She rubbed her temples, feeling the tension coiled in her shoulders. This precinct had always prided itself on its high standards, but this incident had shaken that foundation to its core. Whatever the outcome, Rostova knew the investigation would have consequences that rippled far beyond Evan Roche, affecting the entire department. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the first report, the initial witness statements from the park. She had read them multiple times, and each reading only added to the mounting evidence against her officer. The witnesses, all ordinary park-goers, described the event with stark clarity. Their accounts were unnervingly consistent. Evan had approached Julian Croft with the immediate assumption of guilt without hesitation and without any attempt to de-escalate the situation. Rostova turned to the next file, the body cam footage report. She had watched the video several times, and each viewing was more uncomfortable than the last. The footage was irrefutable. Evan's tone, his body language, his choice of words, all of it reflected the prejudiced assumptions he had made the moment he saw Julian. The aggression in his approach, the way he had dismissed Julian's calm explanations, the unnecessary force used during the arrest, it was all there, laid bare for anyone to see. A knock at the door pulled Rostova from her thoughts. She looked up to see Detective Miles Corbin, her second-in-command for the investigation, standing in the doorway. "I've got the last of the witness interviews," Corbin said, holding up a file, "and I've scheduled Julian Croft for an interview later this afternoon." "Thanks, Miles," Rostova replied, taking the file. "How does it look?" Corbin sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Not good, Captain. The witnesses are all clear on what they saw, and the body cam footage backs up every word." Rostova nodded grimly. "That's what I was afraid of. Are we bringing Roche in for another round of questions?" "Yeah," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Let's see if he's ready to be more forthcoming about what really happened." Corbin nodded and left the office, leaving Rostova alone with the new file. She flipped it open. The new witness statements were consistent with the others. Evan had acted with clear aggression from the start, while Julian had remained calm, clearly trying to diffuse the situation. But Evan hadn't listened. As Rostova finished reading, a deep sense of unease settled over her. She had known Evan for years. He had always been a solid, if sometimes overly zealous officer. This incident had exposed a side of him she had never seen, or perhaps had never wanted to see. The hours ticked by as Rostova continued to review the evidence. Finally, there was another knock. Corbin entered, followed by Evan Roche. "Come in, Roche," Rostova said, keeping her voice neutral. Evan looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. He sat across from Rostova, glancing nervously at Corbin, who took a seat beside him. "We're going to go over the events of that day one more time," Rostova began, leaning forward. "I need you to be completely honest with us, Evan. This is your chance to explain your side of this." Evan nodded, his expression tight. "I understand, Captain." Rostova glanced at Corbin, who started the questioning. "Evan, walk us through what was going through your mind when you first saw Julian Croft in the park." Evan hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for the right words. I saw a man who fit the description of a suspect we were looking for. It was a high-pressure situation. I had to make a snap judgment." "And what made you so certain he was the suspect?" Corbin pressed. "He matched the description," Evan repeated, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "We were looking for a black male, around his height and build. He was acting suspiciously, like he was trying to hide something." Rostova could hear the strain in his voice, the way he was grasping at justifications. "Evan, the witness statements and the body cam footage tell a very different story. They show that Mr. Croft was cooperative, that he tried to explain who he was, but you refused to listen." Evan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He was trying to throw me off, buy time. I was just following my training, Captain." "Your training?" Rostova repeated, her tone sharp. "Evan, your training does not excuse racial profiling. It doesn't excuse the fact that you escalated a situation that should never have been escalated." Evan opened his mouth to respond, but Rostova held up a hand. "Look, Evan, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to find the truth. The evidence we have gathered so far does not look good for you. It shows that you made assumptions based on race, and that those assumptions led to a wrongful and unjust arrest." There was a long, heavy silence as Evan processed her words. Finally he spoke, his voice low and defeated. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to do my job." Rostova sighed. "I know, Evan. But intent doesn't change the impact of your actions. This isn't just about you. It's about what your actions represent and how they affect the people we are sworn to protect. Before Evan could respond, there was another knock at the door. Corbin stood and opened it, revealing Julian Croft, who stepped into the room with a calm, composed demeanor. "Mr. Croft, thank you for coming in," Rostova said, standing to shake his hand. Julian nodded, his expression neutral. "Of course, Captain." Rostova motioned for him to take a seat, then turned back to Evan. "Evan, we're going to hear from Mr. Croft now. I want you to listen very carefully." Evan nodded, though he couldn't bring himself to meet Julian's eyes. Rostova gestured for Corbin to begin. "Mr. Croft, can you describe your encounter with Officer Roche from your perspective?" Julian's voice was steady. "I was in the park enjoying a day off when Officer Roche approached me. He was aggressive from the outset, demanding my ID and questioning me as if I were already guilty. I tried to explain that I was a federal agent, that there had to be some mistake, but he wouldn't listen. He cuffed me and treated me like a common criminal." Evan flinched at Julian's words but remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Corbin continued. "Did you feel that Officer Roche's actions were influenced by your race?" Julian didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. I could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at me, the assumptions he made before I even had a chance to speak. I've dealt with this kind of thing my whole life, but it's different when it comes from someone who is supposed to protect and serve." Rostova could see the impact of Julian's words on Evan, the way his shoulders slumped, the way he seemed to shrink into himself. Still, Evan said nothing. "Thank you, Mr. Croft," Rostova said. "I appreciate your honesty." Julian nodded, then stood to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and turned back to Evan. "I don't hold any personal grudge, Officer Roche, but I hope you can use this as an opportunity to learn, to understand the impact of your actions. It's not just about what you intended. It's about how your intentions play out in the real world." With that, Julian left, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Rostova looked at Evan, who was still staring at the table. "Evan, this investigation isn't just about what happened. It's about making sure it never happens again. We have to do better, for the people we serve and for ourselves." Evan nodded slowly, but there was no fight left in him. The weight of the evidence, the power of Julian Croft's words, and the reality of his own actions were all starting to sink in. But whether he was ready to fully confront that truth remained to be seen. "Take the rest of the day, Evan," Rostova said quietly. "We'll reconvene tomorrow." Evan stood, his movement stiff, and left the office without another word. As the door closed behind him, Rostova felt a heavy sense of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This investigation was just the beginning. There was so much work still to be done, but for now all she could do was continue to piece together the truth and hope that it would lead to real, lasting change. Captain Eva Rostova sat in her office, the final report of the internal investigation lying closed on her desk. The conclusion was undeniable, and the decision had been made. That, however, did not make the task ahead of her any easier. She glanced at the clock on her wall. Julian Croft would be arriving any minute. The conversation they were about to have felt like a pivotal moment, a turning point, not just for Evan Roche, but for the entire department. A soft knock at the door announced Julian's arrival. Rostova stood, smoothing the front of her uniform as she prepared herself. "Come in," she called. The door opened and Julian entered, his expression as calm and composed as ever. He gave Rostova a polite nod before taking the seat across from her desk. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Croft," Rostova began, sitting down as well. "Of course," Julian replied, his tone steady. "I assume the investigation is complete." "It is," Rostova confirmed, leaning forward slightly. "After a thorough review of all the evidence, the witness statements, the body camera footage, and all subsequent interviews, the board has decided that Officer Roche's employment will be terminated." Julian nodded slowly, processing the information. I appreciate the thoroughness of your investigation, Captain, but I have to ask, do you believe this decision will lead to genuine change within the department? Rostova paused, choosing her words with care. I believe it is a necessary first step. Evan Roche's actions were unacceptable, and his termination sends a clear and unequivocal message that racial profiling and the abuse of authority will not be tolerated here. But I am also acutely aware that firing one officer is not enough to address the deeper systemic issues at play. Julian's gaze remained steady. You're right. This is about more than one officer. It's about the culture within the department, the training your officers receive, and the unconscious biases that can influence their decisions in the field. If we don't address those underlying factors, incidents like this one will continue to happen. Rostova nodded, appreciating his candor. I agree completely. This incident has been a harsh spotlight on the need for systemic change, and I am personally committed to making that happen. We are already in the process of completely overhauling our training programs to include more comprehensive and mandatory education on racial bias and de-escalation tactics. We are also implementing more rigorous oversight and accountability measures. That's a good start, Julian said, a hint of approval in his voice. But it will take more than just new policies. It's about changing the mindset of the officers. It's about helping them understand the profound impact their actions have on the communities they serve. That's not something that can be achieved overnight. I know, Rostova admitted. It's going to be a long and difficult process, but it's a necessary one if we want to rebuild trust and ensure that what happened to you never ever happens to someone else. Julian leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I've been in law enforcement long enough to know that change never comes easily, especially when it involves confronting uncomfortable truths. But I am willing to work with you, Captain, to help make those changes a reality. This isn't just about me. It's about creating a safer, more just system for everyone. Rostova felt a surge of respect for the man sitting across from her. Despite everything he had endured, he was still willing to engage, to push for the very reforms that were so desperately needed. I appreciate that more than you know, Mr. Croft, she said sincerely. Your experience and your insight will be invaluable as we move forward, and I want you to know your voice will be heard. Julian nodded. Thank you, Captain. I'm not looking for any special treatment. I just want to make sure this department becomes the best version of itself. That's what the community deserves, and frankly, that's what your officers deserve, too. Rostova couldn't agree more. You're right, and I promise you, we are committed to making that a reality. The room fell into a comfortable silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on the weight of the conversation. The decision to fire Evan Roche was just the beginning. The real arduous work lay ahead. As Julian stood to leave, Rostova rose as well, extending her hand. Thank you again, Mr. Croft. I look forward to working with you. Julian shook her hand firmly. Likewise, Captain. Let's make sure this is a turning point, not just a momentary reaction. With that, Julian left the office, leaving Rostova alone with her thoughts. She glanced at the closed investigation report on her desk one last time before turning her attention to the future. The decision had been made. Now it was up to her and her department to ensure that it led to real, lasting, and meaningful change. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and unforeseen challenges, but Eva Rostova was ready. This was about more than one officer, more than one incident. It was about doing what was right, no matter how hard it might be. With a renewed sense of determination, she reached for her phone and began to make the calls that would set the wheels of reform in motion. The morning was overcast as Julian Croft walked up the steps of the precinct, the air feeling heavy, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, yet charged with a new kind of energy. The changes Captain Rostova had promised were beginning to take root, but everyone understood there was a long road ahead. As Julian entered the building, he noticed the subtle shifts. A new bulletin board near the entrance displayed information about upcoming mandatory workshops on community relations and de-escalation techniques. Officers moved through the halls with a different demeanor, their conversations quieter, more serious. The events of the past few weeks had left an indelible mark. Julian made his way to Captain Rostova's office, nodding politely to the officers he passed. Some returned the gesture with a newfound respect, while others still avoided his gaze, grappling with the fallout. When he reached Rostova's office, the door was slightly ajar. He knocked softly before pushing it open. "Come in," Rostova called, looking up from her desk. Julian stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Rostova rose from her chair, offering him a warm smile. "Good to see you again, Mr. Croft." "Likewise, Captain," Julian replied, taking a seat. "I wanted to check in to see how things were progressing." Rostova nodded, her expression serious but determined. "We're making headway. The new training programs are being rolled out next week, and we're implementing stricter oversight, protocols to ensure accountability. It's a start, but there's still a lot of work to be done." Julian appreciated her honesty. "Change takes time, but it's encouraging to see the steps you're taking. How is the department handling it?" "There's been some pushback," Rostova admitted. "Not everyone is on board, but most of the officers understand that these changes are necessary. We've had a few difficult but productive conversations. I'm hopeful that we're moving in the right direction." Julian leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. "That's good to hear. It's important to keep the momentum going, to make sure these changes are more than just a temporary response to one incident." "Agreed," Rostova said. "This is about building a new foundation for how we operate, one that's rooted in fairness and respect for every single person we serve." As they spoke, the door to the office opened again, and Evan Roche stepped inside. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He was dressed in civilian clothes and held a small cardboard box in his hands. It was clear he was here to collect the last of his personal belongings. "Captain," Evan greeted Rostova stiffly, his eyes avoiding Julian. "Evan," Rostova replied, her tone neutral. For a moment the room was silent, the air thick with unresolved history. Finally Evan turned to Julian, his expression tight. "Mr. Croft, I wanted to say, I didn't mean for things to turn out the way they did." Julian met his gaze calmly. "It's not about what you meant, Mr. Roche. It's about what you did and the impact it had. Good intentions don't excuse harmful actions." Evan flinched at the bluntness of his words, but he nodded, a flicker of acceptance in his eyes. "I know, I don't know how to fix this." "You can start by acknowledging the problem," Julian said evenly. "We all have biases. The question is how we deal with them. You have an opportunity now to learn from this, to become a better person because of it." Evan's shoulders slumped, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He turned back to Rostova, his voice barely a whisper. "I suppose this is it then?" Rostova nodded, her expression softening. "It doesn't have to be the end, Evan. You can still choose to grow from this, to make positive changes in your life. But that choice is up to you." Evan stood there for a long moment, as if considering her words, before giving a brief, almost imperceptible nod. "I'll think about it." He paused, then added, "Good luck, Captain. And to you as well, Mr. Croft." With that, Evan turned and left the office, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click. Rostova and Julian watched him go, both lost in thought. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Julian asked after a moment. Rostova sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I hope so, but it's out of our hands now. All we can do is focus on the work ahead of us." Julian nodded in agreement, "And there's plenty of that." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Finally Julian stood, extending his hand to Rostova. Thank you for everything, Captain. I appreciate your commitment to making things right." Rostova shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Croft. Your involvement has been invaluable. We're in this together." With that, Julian turned and left the office, making his way through the precinct one last time. As he walked down the halls, he could feel the eyes of the officers on him, some curious, some contemplative. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, but he also knew, with every fiber of his being, that it was necessary. The events of the past few weeks had opened a door, and now it was up to all of them to have the courage to walk through it. As Julian stepped out into the cool morning air, he took a deep breath, a sense of quiet resolve settling over him. The path ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to continue the fight for justice. This was just the beginning, and he was determined to see it through. With renewed purpose, Julian Croft walked away from the precinct, his mind already turning to the next steps. There was so much more to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a genuine glimmer of hope. Change was coming, and he would be there to help guide it every step of the way.